Amici, friends of a universe still undiscovered, if this desperate echo reaches you, consider yourselves witnesses to the final act of a man who loved truth more than his own skin. You're tuned in to the Heretic's Hymn, broadcasting live, or more accurately, burning live, from a very public, very enthusiastic pyre in Rome in the year of our Lord 1600. I am Giordano Bruno, and if the sheer impossible audacity of this trans-dimensional broadcast from a moment when a single truth is deemed a capital crime doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to understanding reality, then frankly, your mind is as small as their worldview. Do it now, before the heat melts your receiver. And tell me, if this peculiar connection holds, from what strange, unburnt corner of your world are you listening? What year has logic decreed for you, and what hour do these unyielding tidings reach you? We're taking notes for posterity. Now, turn your eyes to the stars, and let us dissect the glorious, tragic business of an infinite universe. To understand why a man was burned alive in the year 1600, you must first understand the universe he tried to tear down. It wasn't our universe, vast and indifferent. No, their cosmos was a far cozier affair. Imagine living inside a perfectly constructed, divinely ordained snow globe. The air was thick with certainty, the sky a solid, reassuring ceiling, and at the very center of it all was you. Well, not you specifically, but humanity, which, for the powers that were, was close enough. It was a universe built for comfort, not for questions. At the heart of this grand design lay the earth, stationary, immovable. It did not spin or orbit, it simply was. This wasn't a scientific conclusion so much as a theological necessity. The earth was the stage for the great drama of human sin and salvation. You don't move the stage while the play is ongoing. It's terribly unprofessional. All of creation, from the smallest blade of grass to the most distant star, was arranged around this single, stationary, important speck of dirt. It was the ultimate piece of divine real estate. And the heavens? A masterpiece of celestial mechanics and wishful thinking. The moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn weren't floating in a vacuum. They were embedded in a series of transparent, crystalline spheres, nested perfectly inside each other, like transparent Russian dolls. These spheres, made of an incorruptible fifth element called aether, rotated with flawless, silent precision. It was God's own clockwork, ticking in sublime harmony, forever shielding humanity from the raw, terrifying chaos of the void beyond. This model wasn't just astronomy. It was a cosmic comfort blanket. It confirmed humanity's special place in creation. God wasn't some distant, abstract landlord. He was the architect living just upstairs, beyond the outermost sphere of fixed stars. The structure of the universe reinforced the structure of society and faith. The heavens were ordered, so society must be. The cosmos had a center, so life had purpose. Every sunrise was a personal reminder that you were the focus of God's attention. To doubt this model was not to doubt a theory, it was to doubt God's love. Ah, the old model. A beautiful, simple box. God on top, man in the middle, and a few little lights on the ceiling. It was tidy, it was safe. It was, of course, a ridiculous lie, but very comforting, and much safer for the man who believed it. This celestial prison was so exquisitely constructed that most people never even thought to rattle the bars. Why would they? They had the best seat in the house, a front-row ticket to the only show in the universe. The price of admission was to never, ever look behind the curtain. But Giordano Bruno was a man who lived to peek behind curtains. He didn't just rattle the bars. He tried to sledgehammer the prison to dust. He looked at the cozy ceiling of stars and didn't see a final boundary. He saw a gateway. He suggested those little lights weren't just celestial decorations. They were other suns, just like our own. And circling those suns were other worlds, perhaps even with other thinking beings. Suddenly, the universe wasn't a tidy box, it was infinite. The number of worlds approached infinity. Humanity was no longer the star of the play. We might not even be in the cast. This idea was more dangerous than any army. An infinite universe has no center. And if there is no center, where is the humanity? Where is Earth? More importantly, where is the throne of God? And if there are other worlds, did Christ have to be crucified on each one to save their souls? The questions his philosophy raised were not merely academic, they were terrifying. They threatened to shatter the foundations of power, faith, and meaning that had governed Europe for 1,000 years. It was a fire of an idea, and the old order knew only one way to fight fire. This was the universe you were told to believe in, a story so perfect it was worth killing for. But some stories are meant to be burned, and some truths are worth dying for. Bruno chose his side. He faced the flames rather than retreat into the comfortable lie. His story is a testament to the brutal, bloody birth of our modern cosmos. If you have the courage to stare into that fire, to watch the old world burn, and see what magnificent universe was born from its ashes, then prove it. Honor the rebels. Click that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join us on a journey for those who prefer dangerous truth to a safe lie.
Into the neat and tidy prison of the 16th century cosmos walked a man with a sledgehammer for a mind. His name was Giordano Bruno. He was not a quiet, star-gazing academic in the mold of Copernicus, carefully hedging his bets. He was a philosopher, a poet, a magician of memory, and a defrocked Dominican friar who had been kicked out of more cities than most people would ever visit. He was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly incapable of keeping his revolutionary thoughts to himself. He was born Filippo Bruno in Nola, near Naples, but took the name Giordano upon entering the Dominican order. This was an institution known for producing the Church's most formidable intellectuals and its most feared inquisitors. Bruno, it seems, managed to absorb the former's intellectual rigor while developing a deep and personal antipathy for the latter's methods. He read voraciously, not just the approved texts of Aristotle and Aquinas, but forbidden works, the whispers of ancient philosophers and hermetic mystics. His mind was a library of dangerous ideas, and his memory was said to be so powerful he could recite thousands of lines of text and reconstruct entire books. He even tried to teach his mnemonic techniques to the King of France. But the most dangerous thing he remembered was that the world could be different. The cozy celestial box everyone lived in was not the only model. It was simply the one that kept the powerful in power and the faithful in line. And Bruno had no interest in either. His first great intellectual crime was his enthusiastic embrace of the Copernican system. Decades earlier, Nicolaus Copernicus had published his work suggesting the Earth was not the center of the universe. He had proposed a heliocentric model where the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun. It was a radical idea, but Copernicus was a cautious man. His book was dense, mathematical, and published as he lay on his deathbed, which is a rather effective way to avoid angry mobs. For most scholars, the Copernican model was a curiosity, a mathematical convenience. You could use its equations to build a better calendar or predict an eclipse, but you weren't supposed to take it literally. The idea that our Earth, the stage of God's entire divine plan, was just another planet was patently absurd. It was like using a fictional story to teach a moral lesson. You praised the lesson, not the absurd fiction it was wrapped in. The geocentric model, U equals E, P1, P2, was reality. But Bruno was not most scholars. He looked at the Copernican model where the Earth, E, became just one of several planets, P, orbiting the Sun, S, and he didn't see a mathematical trick. He saw the literal, physical truth. He saw the first crack in the wall of the cosmic prison. He shouted this truth from the rooftops in Geneva, Paris, London, and across the German states, much to the horror of his hosts. He wasn't just presenting a theory, he was announcing a jailbreak. This alone was enough to make him a pariah. To displace the Earth was to displace humanity from its privileged position. It was to suggest that we were not the center of God's attention. This was the theological equivalent of telling a king he wasn't the center of his own kingdom. It was an idea that induced a kind of cosmic vertigo, and Bruno seemed to delight in pushing people off the ledge. But for him, this was only the beginning.
A universe of infinite worlds requires a traveler of infinite restlessness. Before Giordano Bruno was a martyr for science, he was an intellectual fugitive, a philosopher on the run. His journey was not a grand tour of discovery. It was a desperate 16-year flight across a continent that was determined to misunderstand him. To be Bruno was to be perpetually in motion, always one step ahead of the authorities you had just finished insulting. His life as a vagabond began in the year 1576. He was Brother Giordano, a Dominican friar in Naples, and a member of an order famed for its intellectual prowess and for staffing the Holy Inquisition. Bruno, true to form, was more interested in the former than the latter. He was caught reading the forbidden works of Erasmus and was overheard casting doubt on core tenets of the faith. An investigation was launched. Bruno, knowing the glacial pace and fiery conclusion of such inquiries, decided not to wait for the verdict. He slipped out of the monastery, shed the white habit of the Dominicans, and fled north. This was not a simple career change. In the 16th century, breaking monastic vows was a profound act of rebellion. It made you an outcast, a man without a tribe, without protection. He was adrift in a world where your religious affiliation was your passport, and he had just renounced it. He was a ghost, a man who had officially ceased to exist in the eyes of the Church. His first major stop was the capital of a different kind of orthodoxy, Calvinist Geneva. Perhaps he thought the Protestant Reformation, having broken with Rome, would be more open to new ideas. He was swiftly and brutally corrected. He enrolled at the University of Geneva and, with his characteristic lack of tact, immediately published a broadsheet attacking one of its most distinguished philosophy professors, calling him out for his errors. The response was predictable. Intellectual debate was one thing, publicly humiliating the establishment was another. Bruno was arrested, forced to apologize, and was promptly excommunicated by the Calvinist Church. He had managed to get kicked out of the two major branches of Western Christianity in record time. It was a pattern that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't just looking for truth, he was looking for a fight. Fleeing Geneva, he made his way to France, where his fortunes temporarily changed. In Paris, his astonishing memory skills, the famous art of memory, caught the attention of the French king, Henry III. The king was fascinated, believing Bruno's abilities to be magical. For a brief, shining moment, Bruno was a court celebrity, a philosophical wizard under royal protection. He published several works on mnemonics and was given a professorship. He was finally in a position of comfort and influence. A sane man would have consolidated his position, toned down the rhetoric, and enjoyed the patronage. But Bruno was not a sane man in that conventional sense. He used his newfound security not as a shield, but as a platform from which to launch his most audacious cosmological ideas. He saw the king's favor as a license to think, and he intended to use it to its absolute limit. In 1583, he traveled to England as part of the French ambassador's household. Here, in the land of what he hoped would be Protestant pragmatism, he would compose and publish some of his most important and inflammatory works, including The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast and On the Infinite Universe and Worlds. He was at the peak of his intellectual powers, and his ego had grown to match his intellect. His English adventure is best remembered for one catastrophic event, his debate at Oxford University. Invited to lecture, he championed the Copernican system and his own infinite cosmology. He expected a dazzling exchange of ideas with England's finest minds. What he got was a wall of stubborn Aristotelian dogma. The Oxford dons were not impressed by his flamboyant Italian style or his revolutionary content. The feeling was mutual. Bruno, in his subsequent writings, savaged them. He described the learned doctors of Oxford as a constellation of pedants whose knowledge came from repeating Aristotle, not from observing the sky. He claimed their academic robes were a cover for ignorance, and their degrees were proof of nothing but obstinate foolishness. He had come to England seeking intellectual partners, and left having made a host of powerful, tweed-wearing enemies. His next stop was Germany. By this point, his reputation preceded him. He was the brilliant but abrasive Italian who could charm a king one day and get excommunicated the next. He arrived in Wittenberg, the very heart of the Lutheran Reformation, the city of Martin Luther himself. In a moment of surprising tolerance, the university there offered him a position to teach. For 2 years, he found a measure of peace. But Bruno's mind was a storm, and he carried the weather with him. His peace in Wittenberg did not last. He eventually fell out with the Lutheran establishment, just as he had with the Catholics and the Calvinists. It seemed his personal philosophy was fundamentally incompatible with any organized religion. His list of enemies could be expressed as a tidy set. Enemies equals Catholics, union, Calvinists, union, Lutherans, union, Aristotelians. He was an equal opportunity offender. From Wittenberg, he drifted. He went to Prague, hoping to gain the patronage of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, a man known for his interest in the occult and arcane. He briefly taught at the University of Helmstedt, where he was, yet again, excommunicated by the local Lutheran Church. He was a human lightning rod for controversy, attracting condemnation wherever he stood still for too long. He was a frantic series of intellectual engagements, public debates, and hasty departures. He was a rock star of philosophy, with trashed hotel rooms and angry managers. He supported himself by giving private lessons, by proofreading for printers, and through the fleeting patronage of the curious and the bold. He was a man utterly dedicated to his mission, living a life devoid of physical comfort or stability. He owned little more than the clothes on his back and the explosive universe he carried in his head. Every city was a new stage, and every debate was a battle for the soul of the cosmos. After years of this nomadic existence, a strange and fatal homesickness seems to have rooted, or perhaps it was hubris. In 1591, while living in Frankfurt, he received a letter that would seal his fate. It was an invitation from a Venetian nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo, who wanted to be tutored in the legendary art of memory. To any rational observer, returning to Italy was suicide. It was the one country in Europe where the Roman Inquisition held absolute power, and Bruno was, without a doubt, their most famous and wanted fugitive. His friends in Frankfurt warned him against it, pleading with him not to walk into the lion's den. But Bruno, perhaps believing his own legend, perhaps tired of running, accepted the invitation. He arrived in Venice, a city with a reputation for being slightly more liberal than Rome, but still very much within the Inquisition's reach. He took up residence with Mocenigo and began his lessons. But his patron, it turned out, was not a very good student. Mocenigo grew frustrated, believing Bruno was holding back the true secrets of his magical memory. Or perhaps he was simply horrified by the sheer scale of the heresies his new houseguest spouted on a daily basis. The relationship soured.
Mocenigo, feeling cheated and terrified by the philosopher's blasphemies, did what any frightened, pious nobleman of the time would do. He denounced his teacher to the Venetian Inquisition. In May of 1592, Bruno's 16-year journey across the map of Europe came to an abrupt and brutal end. The wanderer had been snared. The man who had debated in the courts of kings and the halls of great universities was now a prisoner in his own homeland. The intellectual vagabond who had outrun the authorities of 3 different faiths was finally cornered. His life on the run was over. A new, more terrifying chapter was about to begin. They called me a wanderer. I called myself a traveler of ideas. From Venice to Geneva, from London.
To walk into a trap, one must first be tempted by the bait. For Giordano Bruno, a man who had spent 16 years running, the bait was the one thing he craved most: a home. In the year 1591, he was in Frankfurt, a hub of printing and intellectual exchange. He was publishing, debating, and surviving. But he was an exile, a man without roots, speaking and writing in a land that was not his own. The prodigal son, it seems, always hears the whisper of home, even if home is where the monsters are. The whisper came in the form of a letter from one Giovanni Mocenigo, a Venetian patrician of minor standing but major ambition. Mocenigo had heard of the famous Nolan's legendary memory and his secret knowledge. He invited Bruno to Venice, offering him lodging, protection, and generous patronage. All he asked, in return, was that Bruno teach him his art of memory and perhaps a little of his secret philosophy. It was a tantalizing offer, a return to the Italian world under the wing of a wealthy nobleman. Why did he accept? After successfully dodging the authorities of half of Europe, why walk into the one country with a standing warrant for his soul? Perhaps it was hubris, a belief that his intellect could shield him from any danger. Perhaps it was exhaustion, a weariness from a lifetime of running. Or perhaps he simply believed that Venice, the proud and independent republic, was a safe enough harbor. Whatever the reason, he packed his few belongings and made the journey south, a moth drawn to the most brilliant and treacherous flame in Italy. He arrived in Venice and took up residence in the house of his new patron. The arrangement began simply enough. Bruno started to instruct Mocenigo in his complex mnemonic systems, the art of creating mental palaces to store vast quantities of information. But Mocenigo was a poor student. He was impatient. He didn't want to learn a difficult intellectual discipline. He wanted to be given a magic spell, a quick secret to make him powerful and wise. He wanted the fruit of knowledge without the tedious business of planting the tree. Bruno, in turn, could not help but be himself. Alongside the memory lessons, he would talk. And when Bruno talked, universes of heresy bloomed in the air. He spoke of the infinity of worlds, of the earth's motion, of souls transmigrating from body to body, even into animals. He spoke of a God who was not a man on a throne, but an infinite presence within an infinite cosmos. He was offering his student a glimpse into the mind of God. Mocenigo just wanted to learn a better way to memorize his grocery list. The nobleman grew suspicious and then terrified. This was not the entertaining magic he had bargained for. This was soul-endangering blasphemy. He began to believe that Bruno, his houseguest, was a demon, or worse, that he was deliberately withholding the true, most powerful secrets of his art. The relationship curdled from patronage into paranoia.
Mocenigo, a man of weak character and conventional piety, felt cheated, frightened, and deeply offended. The night of the betrayal was a masterpiece of shabby treachery. On the 22nd of May, 1592, Bruno informed Mocenigo that he intended to return to Frankfurt to get some books printed. Mocenigo, feigning friendship, invited him to stay one more night. That evening, as Bruno slept, Mocenigo, accompanied by his servants, burst into his room, locked him in, and then calmly went to inform the Holy Office of the Venetian Inquisition that he had a heretic ripe for the picking. The trap had been sprung. Bruno, the man who had debated kings and outwitted scholars across a continent, was captured without a fight, betrayed by his own student in the dead of night. The next morning, the agents of the Inquisition arrived at Mocenigo's palace. They searched Bruno's few possessions and escorted him to the prison of the Holy Office, a place of damped stone and absolute silence, a stark contrast to the vibrant, noisy world he had inhabited.
When Giordano Bruno arrived in Rome in February of 1593, his 16-year marathon of free thought came to a dead stop. He was taken to the Palace of the Holy Office, a stern, imposing building next to the Vatican. Here, there were no adoring patrons, no university stages, no printing presses. There was only silence, stone, and the slow, grinding bureaucracy of the most efficient thought-policing organization in the world, the Holy Roman Inquisition. The prisons of the Inquisition were not necessarily the gore-splattered dungeons of popular imagination. Their primary weapon was not the rack, but monotony. They were masters of psychological erosion. Bruno was placed in a cell cut off from the world. The man whose mind roamed an infinite cosmos was now confined to a few square feet of stone. The goal was not just to punish the body, but to break the will, to make the universe outside the cell walls seem like a distant, irrelevant dream. This was not a provincial court like the one in Venice. This was the head office. The machine he now faced was deliberate, patient, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness. It did not rush. It had all the time in the world, and it knew that its prisoners did not. Bruno's case file, already thick with Venetian testimony, grew fatter as the Inquisition's agents methodically gathered evidence from every city he had ever disgraced with his presence. His chief adversary in this final battle was not a faceless bureaucrat, but one of the most formidable intellects of the age, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine was no fool. He was a brilliant Jesuit theologian, a scholar, and the Vatican's top expert on heresy. He was not a sadist, he was a doctor of the soul, who saw Bruno as a carrier of a deadly plague, and he was determined to find a cure, or failing that, to cauterize the wound. The confrontation between Bruno and Bellarmine was a clash of titans, a collision of two fundamentally incompatible worlds. Bellarmine's was the universe we have already visited, a finite, ordered creation, with God, man, and the Church in their proper places. Bruno's was the wild, infinite garden. For Bellarmine, any philosophical idea P that contradicted the revealed truth of the faith, F, was by definition a heresy, H. The logic was simple. If P intersect F is equal to empty set, then P implies H. There was no room for negotiation. The trial dragged on for 7 years. It was less a single event than more a slow, agonizing process of attrition. Bruno would be left in isolation for months, his mind aboil with arguments, only to be brought out for a series of interrogations. There he would face a panel of theologians who would dissect his writings line by line, demanding explanations for every phrase that deviated from orthodox doctrine. It was a theological death by 1,000 cuts. He tried his old defense, attempting to separate his philosophical claims from his theological ones. He argued that the idea of infinite worlds was a conclusion of reason, not an article of faith. He was, he claimed, willing to submit to the Church on all matters pertaining to salvation, but he pleaded for the freedom to philosophize. It was a desperate attempt to create a space for thought outside the Church's total authority. The inquisitors, led by Bellarmine, were unmoved. For them, no such space existed. Truth was singular and unified, and its ultimate arbiter was the Church. If his philosophy led him to believe in infinite worlds, a concept absent from Scripture, then his philosophy was wrong. If his reason led him to question the nature of the Trinity, then his reason was corrupt. There could be no distinction between the thoughts of the philosopher and the soul of the Christian. 7 years. They wanted me to admit my universe was a lie. They wanted me to confess my heresy.
I told them my universe was not a theory. It was a truth. They were not pleased. They have very little patience for nuance, these inquisitors. They presented me with a list of my own ideas as if they were a list of my crimes. In a way, they were right. My greatest crime was thinking them. The pressure was immense. Bruno was held in harsh conditions, often denied books, paper, and even light. The interrogations were relentless. The same questions were asked again and again, year after year. The goal was to exhaust him, to confuse him, to make him long for an end to the process, any end. The only escape route they ever offered was a full and unconditional recantation of his errors. This was the Inquisition's brand of mercy. They did not want to burn Bruno. They wanted to break him. A public burning was a messy admission of failure. A public recantation, on the other hand, was a spectacular victory. To have Europe's most famous freethinker kneel before them and admit that his life's work was a devilish lie would be a powerful blow against the rising tide of intellectual curiosity. They didn't just want his body, they wanted his mind. Throughout the trial, they dangled the possibility of torture. The threat, known as the territorial realis, was a standard part of the process. A prisoner would be shown the instruments of torture and the procedure would be explained in clinical detail. It was often enough to secure a confession without ever laying a hand on the accused. We do not know for certain if Bruno was tortured, but he lived under its shadow for 7 long years. The list of condemned propositions from his work was eventually finalized. There were 8 main articles of heresy, including his claims about the eternality of the world, the infinity of the universe, the soul's transmigration, and his denial of core doctrines like the Trinity and the Incarnation. He was given 40 days to consider them and recant. And in a moment of what must have been profound despair, he seemed to do just that. In early 1599, Bruno indicated his willingness to abjure. He signed a document of recantation. The machine appeared to have won. The great rebel, the man with the universe in his head, was finally broken by 7 years in the dark. The inquisitors must have been immensely pleased, but their victory was short-lived. Bruno's spirit, though battered, was not extinguished. Soon after signing, he began to hedge. He claimed he had not truly held the heretical views in the way they imagined. He tried to argue that his recantation only applied to his theological errors, not his philosophical truths. He was trying, one last time, to save his universe. This was his final, fatal mistake. For the Inquisition, this was proof of his insincerity. He was not a penitent son returning to the fold. He was a cunning trickster playing for time. His partial, qualified recantation was seen as a worse offense than his initial defiance. It was proof that he was pertinacious, stubbornly and impenitently attached to his heresy. Patience in the Holy Office, already worn thin by 7 years of debate, finally snapped. Pope Clement VIII, on hearing of Bruno's backtracking, became enraged. He ordered that the trial be brought to an immediate conclusion. There would be no more debates, no more chances to recant. The time of talk was over. In January of the year 1600, the final verdict was delivered. Bruno was found guilty. He was declared an impenitent, pertinacious, and unrepentant heretic. The sentence was read to him. He was to be stripped of his clerical status, handed over to the secular authorities of Rome, and punished as mercifully as possible and without the shedding of blood. This was the standard, chilling euphemism for being burned alive. The Church, in its peculiar logic, did not execute heretics. It merely identified them and handed them over to the state for punishment, thereby keeping its own hands technically clean of the blood it demanded be spilled. Upon hearing his sentence, Bruno did not flinch. He did not beg for mercy or cry out in fear. He rose and faced his judges, men who held his earthly fate in their hands, and with a courage born of absolute conviction, he uttered the words that would echo through history. "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." It was his last act of defiance, a final, stunning reversal. In that moment, the prisoner became the judge, and the judges the prisoners of their own fear. The sentence was passed. The die was cast. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher of the infinite, was now just a condemned man waiting for a fire. The 7-year war of attrition in the dungeons of the Roman Inquisition was over. All that remained was a handful of days, a short, final journey, and a public spectacle designed to terrify anyone else who dared to think so freely. But the trial wasn't truly over, not in Bruno's mind. The Inquisition had passed its judgment. Now he had to pass his. In the final days leading to his execution, the pressure did not cease. It intensified. He was visited in his cell by members of the Brotherhood of St. John the Beheaded, a lay organization whose grim task was to comfort condemned prisoners in their final hours and, more importantly, to extract a last-minute confession. They pleaded with him, prayed over him, and urged him to save his soul and his skin by uttering a few simple words of recantation. The door to mercy, as such it was, remained open a crack. The authorities would have vastly preferred a penitent heretic to a defiant martyr. A recanting Bruno, weeping and submissive at the stake, would have been a magnificent propaganda victory. A defiant Bruno would only plant dangerous seeds of courage in the minds of others. All he had to do was say he was wrong. Just a few words, and the flames could still be exchanged for life imprisonment. It was the last, most tempting bargain. For most people, this would not be a difficult choice. Life in a monastic prison versus an agonizing death by fire. It's not a dilemma that requires a great deal of thought. Lie, apologize, say whatever they want to hear, and live. Survive. But Bruno was not most people. His refusal to take this final, seemingly obvious escape route is the key to understanding the man. Why choose the fire? What kind of spirit is so unyielding that it prefers annihilation to compromise? To understand his choice, we must understand that for Bruno, his philosophy was not a collection of abstract theories. It was not an academic posture. It was the very substance of his being. His infinite universe, with its endless worlds and suns, was not a scientific model. It was a theological revelation. It was the only cosmos vast enough to contain his vision of an infinite God. To deny it would be a form of spiritual suicide, far more terrifying than mere physical death. To recant would mean admitting his God was small. It would mean stuffing the divine back into the neat, tidy box of Aristotelian cosmology. It would mean conceding that the ultimate reality was not a glorious, teeming garden of stars, but a cramped, finite room with a low ceiling. For the man who had spent his life smashing the walls of that room, to agree to rebuild them himself was an unthinkable betrayal.
It was a lie against the nature of God himself. They asked me to compromise, to say my universe was a hypothesis. I refused. A truth, you see, is not a suggestion. It is not a maybe. It simply is. And I, a stubborn Italian, am not in the business of telling lies to save my skin. A very inconvenient virtue, that one. To treat a divine truth as a mere suggestion was a form of cosmic insult he was simply incapable of delivering. This is the heart of the matter. The inquisitors were offering him a deceptively simple way out, a route taken by many other thinkers. He didn't have to say his ideas were false. He just had to admit they were a hypothesis, a supposition for the sake of argument. They were asking him to change his core assertion from a statement of fact, U equals infinity, to a statement of possibility, P of U equals infinity. This would have saved him. It would have acknowledged the Church's ultimate authority on matters of truth, while allowing him to keep his ideas as a kind of intellectual play toy. He refused. He would not downgrade his truth to the status of a maybe. His universe was not a thought experiment. He had seen it with the eyes of his soul, a reality as solid and undeniable as the stone walls of his cell. To relabel it as a hypothesis would be the most profound lie of all, a betrayal of the very vision for which he had sacrificed everything. A truth for Bruno was not negotiable.
After 7 years of silence, debate, and psychological warfare, the end came with the cold finality of a slamming door. The day of judgment was the 8th of February in the year 1600. The setting was the palace of a prominent cardinal in Rome. There was no public crowd here, no grand theater. This was an internal affair, a final piece of administrative paperwork for the great bureaucracy of faith. The men who would condemn Giordano Bruno to the flames gathered in solemn assembly. Imagine the scene, a room filled with cardinals in their crimson robes, theologians in severe black, and the notaries of the Holy Office with their pens and ink ready to record the final chapter. This was the board meeting for a man's soul. The air would have been thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and the chilling self-assurance of men who believe they are doing God's work. Into this room a prisoner, weakened by years of confinement, but with his spirit still stubbornly intact, was brought to hear his fate. He was made to kneel, a captive audience of one for the final recitation of his life's work, reframed as a catalogue of sins. An official of the Inquisition stood and began to read the sentence. It was a long document, a meticulously crafted summary of the case, detailing the heresies he had espoused, the warnings he had been given, the chances for repentance he had squandered. It was his intellectual biography, read back to him as an indictment. The sentence droned on, listing his crimes against God and reason, his belief in an infinite universe and countless worlds, his questions about the nature of the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, his embrace of magic and his contempt for Aristotle. Each point was a nail, hammered home with merciless Latin precision. He was not just wrong, he was declared a danger, a plague carrier of ideas that threatened to unravel the entire Christian cosmos. The key words, the ones that sealed his doom, were read with grave emphasis. He was found to be an impenitent, pertinacious, and obstinate heretic. Impenitent, he was not sorry. Pertinacious, he clung to his errors with stubborn determination. Obstinate, he was hopelessly, willfully mule-headed. These were not just descriptions, they were legal triggers. They were the words that turned a prison sentence into a death sentence. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, fire. They read the sentence to me solemnly. I, in return, told them they were more afraid to pass judgment than I was to receive it. A very good line, I thought, my final act of defiance before the main event. In that moment, as he knelt before his accusers, Bruno performed his last and greatest act of intellectual jiu-jitsu. He refused the role of the terrified victim. He seized the position of the judge. His response was not a scream of rage or a plea for mercy. It was a cold, sharp, analytical thrust. He looked at the powerful men in their robes, men who held the keys to heaven and the literal torches to his flesh, and he diagnosed their condition: fear. They were afraid of him. They were afraid of his ideas. They were afraid that his infinite universe was real, and their tidy, manageable cosmos was the true lie. He saw terror behind their piety. The cardinals were reportedly stunned into silence. The prisoner was not supposed to talk back, let alone psychoanalyze his judges. He had hijacked the solemn ritual of his own condemnation and turned it into one last unforgettable philosophical statement. He had lost the legal battle, but in that single sentence he claimed a moral victory that would outlast the flames.
But the machinery of the church had more rituals to perform. The verdict was just the beginning. Before he could be handed over to the state to be burned, he had to be formally and ritually stripped of his identity as a priest. This ceremony was known as degradation, and it was a piece of high theological theater. Bruno, who had shed his priest's habit decades earlier, was now forced to put one on for the sole purpose of having it stripped off. He would have been clothed in the vestments of a priest, layer by layer. Then a bishop would have begun the process of removal. The chalice and paten, symbols of the power to celebrate Mass, would be taken from him. Each vestment would be removed with a corresponding prayer, casting him out from the holy orders. It was a meticulous, step-by-step process of spiritual annihilation. The most visceral part of the ritual was the symbolic scraping of his hands. A priest's hands are anointed with holy oil at ordination, setting them apart for the sacred duty of handling the Eucharist. The bishop would have taken a blade or a piece of glass and lightly scraped Bruno's palms and fingertips, symbolically removing the sacred unction and returning his hands to the state of a common layman. He was being officially, ritually, spiritually disowned. Once he was fully degraded, stripped of every last vestige of his former clerical life, the final handover could occur. Here the Inquisition performed its most famous and cynical act of legal fiction. The Church, claiming it abhorred bloodshed, could not itself execute anyone, so the sentence always ended with the same formula. Bruno was to be relaxed to the secular arm, in this case the governor of Rome. The term relaxed is a darkly humorous euphemism, suggesting a gentle release, like loosening a rope. The inquisitors then officially pleaded with the governor to be merciful, to punish the heretic without the shedding of blood. This was the ultimate wink and a nod. Everyone in the room knew that the one form of execution that does not shed blood is burning alive. It was a perfect, self-absolving system. The Church identified the disease and prescribed the cure, but it made the state administer the fatal medicine. This allowed them to maintain a veneer of mercy while ensuring their enemies were thoroughly and publicly incinerated. The state, in turn, was happy to oblige, seeing the enforcement of religious orthodoxy as a key part of maintaining public order. So the state of Bruno was officially transitioned. The ecclesiastical function was complete. We can represent this as a state change. F of be the heretic goes to S of be the condemned. The church function, F, has processed the heretic, be the heretic, and passed him to the secular state, S, for the final disposition of the condemned, be the condemned. The paperwork was in order. The responsibility was successfully laundered. With the sentence passed and the handover complete, Bruno was no longer the Inquisition's prisoner. He was taken from the Holy Office and moved to a state prison, the Tor di Nonna, a notoriously grim tower on the banks of the Tiber. Here he would spend the last 9 days of his life. The end was no longer a matter of if, but simply when. Those 9 days must have been an eternity. The city of Rome was in the midst of its Jubilee year, a massive festival that brought pilgrims from all over Europe. The news of the famous heretic's condemnation would have spread like wildfire. In the public squares, carpenters would have already begun their work, constructing the scaffold and the stake in the bustling market square known as the Campo di Fiori, the Field of Flowers. Even now the attempts to save his soul, or at least to secure a recantation, continued.
The comforters from the Brotherhood would have visited him daily, their prayers mingling with the sounds of the city outside. They offered him a crucifix to kiss. He turned his head away. They offered him a final chance to repent. He refused. His mind was made up. The machine was now on autopilot. The verdict had been rendered, the rituals performed, the secular authorities engaged. The date was set for the 17th of February. The city of Rome, filled with pious pilgrims celebrating a year of grace and forgiveness, was about to witness an extraordinary act of institutional vengeance. A philosopher was about to be turned into a public service announcement. The anticipation in the city would have been a strange mix. The 17th of February, in the Jubilee year of 1600. The day begins like any other in Campo de Fiori, the field of flowers. The air is crisp, and the square, normally a bustling marketplace filled with the smells of fresh produce, fish and bread, is electric with a different kind of energy. Today, the main attraction is not a prize melon, but the public purification of a human soul by fire. At the center of the square stands a stark wooden stake surrounded by a meticulously constructed pyre. It is a work of art in its own gruesome way. This was not a crude bonfire. It was a carefully engineered instrument of terror. The wood was stacked to burn hot and slow, to prolong the spectacle. Bags of gunpowder were sometimes mixed in, not as an act of mercy to hasten death, but to create loud, terrifying explosions, adding to the theatrical effect. This was a state-sponsored performance, and every detail was managed to maximize its psychological impact. The executioner was not just a killer, he was a stage manager for a drama of absolute power. The show begins with a procession. Giordano Bruno is led from his cell in the Tor di Nonna prison. The journey to the Campo de Fiori is not a direct one. He is paraded through the winding streets of Rome, a final tour of the city that would now consume him. This walk of shame was an integral part of the punishment, designed to display the humbled heretic to the faithful citizens. He is a living sermon, a walking cautionary tale for all to see. He is accompanied by the black-robed members of the Brotherhood of St. John the Beheaded, still murmuring prayers and exhortations for him to repent. They are the grim ushers of the afterlife, a constant, pious presence reminding him and the crowds of the spiritual stakes. Soldiers flank the procession, keeping the path clear and maintaining order. The power of both church and state are on full display, united in the task of dispatching one troublesome philosopher. And then there is the crowd. They have gathered from all corners of the city and from the droves of Jubilee pilgrims visiting Rome. They line the streets, they pack the square, they jostle for a better view from windows and rooftops. They are a complex beast, this crowd, a roiling mix of human emotions, from morbid curiosity to fervent piety, from pity to outright bloodlust. An execution is, after all, a holiday from the mundane. Why do they watch? For some, it is a religious duty, a participation in the act of purging the community of a dangerous contagion. They see Bruno as a monster, a cancerous cell that must be excised for the health of the body politic. Their cheers are for the triumph of the faith. For others, it is simply a spectacle, the most dramatic reality television of its day. It is a raw, visceral experience, a brush with mortality that makes one feel more alive.
The square, a carnival of cruelty. The crowd watching with a morbid glee. A symbol, you see, a message. Think our thoughts, or this will happen to you. A very effective form of public education if you don't mind the screaming. The entire event is a carefully calibrated lesson in obedience. The function is simple, F of public execution, to lead to obedience. The pain of the one is meant to ensure the compliance of the many. As Bruno was led into the square, the noise of the crowd would swell, a wave of jeers, prayers, and excited chatter. He is brought to the foot of the stake. Here the final preparations are made. He is stripped of his clothes, a final act of humiliation that reduces him from a philosopher to a piece of naked, vulnerable flesh. This was meant to erase his identity, to show that before the power of the church and state he is nothing. But the authorities feared Bruno to the very end. They feared his mind, his arguments, and most of all, they feared his tongue. They could not risk him delivering a final defiant speech to the crowd, planting seeds of doubt or rebellion. So they employed a particularly cruel instrument of silence. A metal gag, sometimes called an iron bridle, was forced into his mouth. This device often included a spike that pierced the tongue, making speech physically impossible and excruciatingly painful. Another spike might be pointed at the palate. His crime was one of speech and thought, so his punishment was designed to be a literal and symbolic silencing. The man of infinite words was to die without being able to utter a single one. The symbolism is unmistakable. The institution that claimed to be the vessel of the word, the Logos, could not tolerate a competing voice. The ultimate argument of absolute power is not reason or persuasion, but force. They could not win the debate, so they chose to physically shut the debater's mouth. It was a stark admission of intellectual defeat disguised as a righteous punishment. Even gagged and chained, Bruno had one last act of defiance left in him. The comforters, ever persistent, offered him a painted tablet bearing the image of Christ on the cross. They implored him with gestures to kiss it, to make a final sign of submission and save his soul from eternal damnation. This was his last chance to play their game, to die as a penitent Christian. According to the eyewitness accounts, Bruno, with what little movement he had left, turned his face away in scorn. He refused the crucifix. He would not, in his final moments, give them the satisfaction. He would not seek comfort from the symbols of the very institution that was murdering him. He was choosing to die entirely on his own terms, in his own universe, loyal only to his own vision of the divine. With this final silent rejection, the rituals were complete. There was nothing left to do but light the pyre. The executioner, having done his work of chaining the prisoner to the stake, took a lit torch and touched it to the base of the pyre. The dry wood and kindling caught quickly. A wisp of smoke, then a flicker of orange, and then a roar as the flames greedily climbed the pyre. The spectacle had reached its crescendo. The heat would have been immense, driving the front rows of the crowd back. The roar of the fire would have drowned out the sounds of the city, the smell of burning pitch, wood, and then, sickeningly, of human flesh, would have filled the air. It was a total sensory assault, designed to be unforgettable. It was the creation of a powerful engram of fear, an fear, to be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Through the smoke and shimmering heat, the crowd would have seen the silhouette of a man being consumed. They were witnessing the transformation of a human being into a symbol, a warning. They were watching the ultimate expression of power, the power to decide what is true and the power to destroy those who disagree. The philosopher of the infinite was reduced to ash and smoke, dissipating into the finite Roman sky. When the flames finally died down, there was nothing left but charred wood and bone. His ashes, the last physical remains of the man Giordano Bruno, were gathered up and unceremoniously scattered into the Tiber River. This was the final act of erasure. No body, no tomb, no shrine. They wanted him to vanish completely, to become a ghost, a half-forgotten rumor. They failed. The spectacle they created to enforce obedience also created a martyr for intellectual freedom. The horror of the event ensured it would be remembered. The story of the philosopher who was burned for believing in other worlds became a legend, a rallying cry for future generations of freethinkers. In trying to burn away his memory, they ironically branded it onto the conscience of the world. The field of flowers had lived up to its name that day, producing a strange and terrible bloom. The smoke that rose from the pyre carried a message far different than the one the Inquisition intended. It was a signal fire, announcing not the death of a heresy, but the birth of a new kind of courage, the courage to face the fire for an idea.
In the grand theater of cruelty that was a public execution, every action had a purpose, every gesture a meaning. But in the final moments of Giordano Bruno, as he stood chained to the stake in the field of flowers, the authorities reserved for him a special and profoundly symbolic cruelty. It was an act born not of righteousness, but of pure, unadulterated fear. They were terrified of his last words. For 16 years, Bruno's voice had echoed across Europe. It had lectured in the halls of Oxford, debated in the courts of Paris, and thundered from the professorships of Germany. His voice was his primary instrument, a tool of dazzling rhetoric, scathing sarcasm, and revolutionary philosophy. It had charmed kings, enraged scholars, and dismantled entire worldviews. It was the source of all his troubles, and the authorities were determined that it would not have the last word. They had spent 7 years trying to defeat him in debate within the silent walls of the Inquisition. They had failed. He had parried their arguments, questioned their premises, and refused to yield his intellectual ground. Even in his final sentencing, he had turned the tables on them, accusing them of fear. They knew that if given a chance to address the massive crowd in the Campo dei Fiori, he would not use his last breath to beg for mercy. He would use it to preach his gospel of infinity one last time. This was a risk they could not afford to take. The purpose of the execution was to be a lesson in obedience, a demonstration of absolute power. A final defiant speech from the condemned could poison the lesson, transforming a spectacle of fear into a spectacle of courage. It could turn a heretic into a hero. His last words could become a new scripture for the free thinkers of Rome. And so a decision was made. The voice had to be stopped. To accomplish this, they employed an instrument of exquisite cruelty, a device known as an iron bridle or gag, the mordacchia. It was a torturer's masterpiece, designed not to kill, but to utterly control a person's ability to speak. It was a metal framework that clamped over the head, with a flat plate or block that was forced into the mouth to hold down the tongue.
But for a heretic as dangerous as Bruno, a simple gag was not enough. His device, according to eyewitness accounts, featured an added innovation of singular brutality. A long, sharp spike that was driven through the tongue itself, pinning it to the floor of his mouth. Another spike may have been pointed upwards at his palate. It was a machine designed to make the very thought of forming a word an exercise in agony. This was not just about preventing sound. It was about punishing the organ of the crime. His tongue was the traitor, the limb that had crafted the blasphemies. Therefore, the tongue itself had to be pierced, punished, and symbolically killed before the rest of the body. It was the physical manifestation of their argument. If you use your voice to speak against us, we will literally destroy your voice. There is a sublime and terrible irony here. The institution executing him, the Roman Church, was built upon the concept of the Logos, the divine Word made flesh. Its Gospels were the good news, its purpose to spread the Word of God to the corners of the earth. Its power was rooted in speech, in sermons, in scripture, in the performative utterance of a priest transforming bread and wine. And yet here, its final argument against a competing worldview was to jam a piece of sharpened iron through a man's tongue. My tongue. They want to silence me, to prevent my words from reaching the crowd. Fools! A voice can be silenced, but an idea once born, cannot be burned. It is a very foolish thing to think you can silence the truth with wood and iron. They believed that by destroying the speaker, they could destroy the speech. It is the timeless fallacy of every tyrant and every censor. They failed to understand a fundamental principle of information. The more you try to suppress an idea, the more you signal its importance. The act of silencing Bruno was the loudest possible admission that his words had power. If his philosophy was truly nonsense, the ravings of a madman, why take such extreme measures to prevent it from being heard? You don't gag a man for speaking harmless gibberish. You gag him for speaking a dangerous truth. Their brutal equation was simple. Let thee be the heretic's voice. The function of the gag, F, was to ensure that F of V tends to 0. But in doing so, they created an inverse reaction. Let I be the idea. The perceived importance of that idea, IMP of I, became inversely proportional to the voice they were trying to silence. As they drove the voice to 0, the power and importance of the idea approached infinity in the minds of those who would later hear his story. IMP of I tends to infinity. This fear of the spoken word is a constant throughout human history. From the ancient Athenians sentencing Socrates for corrupting the youth with his questions, to modern totalitarian regimes jamming radio broadcasts and blocking websites. The first act of any power structure built on a fragile narrative is to control the flow of competing narratives. Bruno's gag was just a 16th century version of a state-sponsored firewall. The act was also a public one. The crowd saw the gag being forced into his mouth. They were meant to see it. It was part of the lesson. The message was not just don't hold these beliefs. It was don't even speak of them. It was an attack on the very concept of public discourse. A clear signal that some ideas were so dangerous they were not even eligible for discussion. Imagine the sheer physical agony of that moment, the piercing pain, the taste of blood and iron, the humiliation. It was an act designed to break a man, to reduce him to a terrified, suffering animal. But all accounts suggest that even this did not break Bruno. He was gagged, but he was not conquered. His spirit, it seemed, was beyond their reach. With his mouth now a prison of iron and pain, his final defiance had to be a silent one. He was chained to the stake. The executioner began his work. The black-robed comforters swarmed him one last time, holding up a crucifix, pleading for him to give a final sign of repentance. All he had to do was nod. He did the opposite. He turned his head away. This was his last sermon, delivered in the pure, unambiguous language of silence. It was an act of magnificent contempt. It said, "I reject you. I reject your symbols, your threats, your false mercy. I will not grant you the satisfaction of a single conforming gesture." His silence screamed louder than any words he could have spoken. This is the ultimate failure of censorship. It assumes that communication is limited to the mouth. But a human being communicates with their entire being. By taking his voice, they forced him to channel all of his defiance into his eyes, into the set of his jaw, into the simple, powerful act of turning his head. They elevated his final gesture into an immortal portrait of courage. The fire was lit, the flames rose, and the man in the iron gag died. He could not scream, he could not pray, he could not curse his executioners. He could only endure, a silent silhouette against a backdrop of fire. The authorities achieved their goal. They had prevented his last words. They had, for a few moments, silenced a voice. But the story of the gag, of the pierced tongue, became one of the most enduring parts of his legend. It became the ultimate symbol of the brutal lengths to which power will go to protect itself from an idea. The instrument, meant to guarantee his silence, ended up amplifying his message for centuries to come. It became the prologue to every book he ever wrote, the footnote to every his thought.
A single torch, a simple flame. This is the final argument of an authority that has run out of ideas. In the Campo de' Fiori, on the 17th of February 1600, the executioner steps forward. The crowd holds its collective breath. The moment has arrived. He touches the torch to the dry kindling at the base of the pyre. There is a soft crackle, an almost gentle sound, before the roar begins. A wisp of smoke, then a lick of orange, then a hungry rush of fire. The spectacle has begun. The first sensation is the heat, not the gentle warmth of a hearth, but a sudden, violent wave, a physical blow that dries the air and stings the eyes. The smoke comes next, thick and acrid, a choking cloud that smells of burning pitch and wood. It is a prelude, an appetizer for the main course of agony. The flames, still low, begin to climb, their tendrils reaching, grasping, tasting the air around the condemned man's feet. This is the point where the abstract reality of the sentence becomes a screaming physical fact. For 9 years, Bruno's battle was one of the mind, a war of words and ideas fought in cold, damp cells. Now the battle is reduced to the most primal level, flesh versus fire. It is a contest the flesh cannot win. The fire does not debate. It does not reason.
it only consumes. The pain would be immediate and absolute, a neurological explosion that overwhelms every other thought. The nerve endings in the skin screaming their protest, sending a firestorm of signals to a brain that can barely process the overload. It is a pain that has no shape, no direction, only an all-consuming, eternal present. This is the mercy of the Inquisition, the punishment without the shedding of blood, a clean, neat, all-encompassing agony. For the crowd, it is a moment of high drama. They see a man engulfed in flame, his silhouette twisting against the inferno. They hear the roar of the fire, perhaps punctuated by the crack of gunpowder packets. They are witnessing the power of the state and the church made manifest, a terrifying and purging fire that cleanses the community of its impurities. They are seeing what happens when you disobey. But what is happening inside the mind of the man in the fire? Gagged, unable to scream, his body being unmade by the heat, where does the consciousness go? Does it break? Does it surrender to the blackness of oblivion, or does it, in a final, extraordinary act of will, perform one last philosophical transformation? Does it escape? The flames, they rise, they lick. My body burns, but my spirit soars, up to the stars, to the infinite universe I loved. This is not my death, this is my ascension, my final proof. In this inferno he finds not an end, but a transfiguration. The fire ceases to be an instrument of torture and becomes an engine of release. This is the ultimate alchemy of the mind, to take the most profound suffering imaginable and reforge it into an act of triumph. The pain is real, but it is temporary. It is the agony of a vessel breaking apart. It is the shell of the rocket burning away during launch. The physical self, the body that tramped across Europe and languished in dungeons, is merely fuel. The spirit, the consciousness that dreamed of infinite worlds, is the passenger. He looks not with his burning eyes, but with the eye of his mind, and sees the cosmos he always knew was there. He sees the earth shrink away below him, a small, troubled sphere run by small, frightened men. He sees the sun not as a unique lantern for humanity, but just as one star among countless others, a single candle in a boundless cathedral of light. The crystalline spheres of Aristotle and Ptolemy, the celestial prison he fought his whole life to demolish, shatter into a final silent memory. He passes through them unhindered. He flies past the moon, past Mars, past Jupiter. He sees them not as wandering gods embedded in celestial clockwork, but as worlds, as places, each one a unique creation in the infinite garden of being. The fire that consumes his body becomes the light that illuminates his journey. He is moving at the speed of thought, his spirit unchained from the slow, clumsy vessel of flesh. He is pure intellect, pure awareness, soaring through the endless void he had always described. This is not a metaphor. For him, in this final moment, it is the ultimate reality. He is going home. He reaches the supposed boundary of the old universe, the sphere of the fixed stars, but for him there is no boundary. He passes through it as if it were a mist, and on the other side, more stars, more suns, more worlds, an ocean of possibilities stretching out in every direction forever. He has reached his destination, the infinite. I, spirit, tends to infinity. This is his final proof. His inquisitors, with their finite God and their finite universe, could only inflict a finite punishment on a finite body. They could burn his flesh, scatter his ashes, and erase his name from their books, but they could not touch his soul, which, like his universe, was infinite. By destroying his body, they had inadvertently liberated his spirit to join the cosmos he so loved. The execution was a failure. It was his graduation. Let us summarize the final beautiful equation of his life. Let his body be represented as body, and his idea of an infinite universe as idea. The action of the Inquisition was simple. Fire of body tends to zero. They succeeded in reducing his physical form to nothing. But the unintended consequence of this act was its effect on his philosophy. Idea tends to infinity. In trying to extinguish him, they made his idea immortal. From the ashes of the pyre in the Campo de' Fiori, rose the legend of Bruno, the story of the man who was burned for believing in other worlds, who faced the flames with silent contempt, became a powerful myth. He became a patron saint for rebels, for heretics, for scientists, for anyone who dared to think differently. The Church wanted to make him a warning. Instead, they made him an inspiration. The smoke cleared, the crowd went home, the ashes were swept away, but the idea remained. The idea that the universe is far vaster, stranger, and more magnificent than any dogma would have us believe. The idea that the human spirit has a right, even a duty, to explore that vastness without fear. The idea that courage is not the absence of pain, but the ability to find meaning within it. His death was not an ending. It was an event horizon. On one side, the life of a single, brilliant, troublesome man. On the other, the birth of a powerful and enduring symbol of intellectual freedom. He crossed that horizon in a blaze of agony and glory, and in doing so achieved a kind of immortality that his executioners could not have imagined. He showed the world that you can kill a man, but you cannot kill a question. You can burn a book, but you cannot burn a thought. You can silence a voice, but you cannot silence an echo. His echo has reverberated for more than 400 years, a constant reminder of the terrible price and the ultimate triumph of a free mind. The fire in the field of flowers eventually went out, but the fire that Bruno lit in the minds of others, the fire of curiosity, of wonder, of defiance against dogmatic certainty, that fire has never been extinguished. It is passed from generation to generation. The last embers cool in the Campo de' Fiori. The executioners have washed the soot from their hands. The crowd has gone home to their dinners, and the ashes of a philosopher have been scattered upon the indifferent waters of the Tiber. The great spectacle of fear is over. The power of the Church has been demonstrated. A lesson has been taught. And as dusk settles over Rome, the first stars begin to appear in the evening sky. They emerge one by one, cold, distant, and serene. Venus, then Jupiter, then the 1,000 other points of light that spangle the deepening twilight. They shine down on the guilty and the innocent alike. They shine on the Pope in his palace, and on the spot in the market square where a man was just burned for claiming they were suns. They shine with a profound, cosmic, and utterly infuriating indifference. This is perhaps the greatest and most beautiful irony of Giordano Bruno's story. He died in a passion of fire and conviction for a universe that did not know his name, did not feel his pain, and did not register his sacrifice. His was a love affair entirely in one direction. He gave his life for the glory of the cosmos, and the cosmos did not even send a representative to the funeral. He was a martyr for a cause whose beneficiary was completely unaware of his martyrdom. The stars he died defending continued their silent, gravitational dance, their paths utterly unaltered by the brief, noisy, and violent human drama that had just concluded below. Their majestic procession across the night sky was not a salute to their fallen champion. It was just physics. They burned me for a truth they could not see. But the stars bear witness. They do not care for your pope, for your dogma, for your fears. They simply are. And I, a small man in a great universe, simply loved them. A very simple love, that. This was the heart of his final, unshakable peace. His love for the universe required no reciprocation. It was not a bargain. It was an act of pure perception. The stars bear witness not as conscious observers, but by their very being. Their existence is the evidence. Each point of light is a rebuttal to the Inquisition's cramped cosmology. Each distant sun is a testament against their earth-centric arrogance. The universe itself was Bruno's star witness, and it is a witness that can neither be bribed, nor intimidated, nor tortured into silence. The relationship between the human drama, D sub H, and the universe, U, is not one of mutual influence. In reality, U is not proportional to D sub H. The universe is entirely independent of our small affairs. Bruno's sacrifice, S sub B, did not change the universe one iota. The partial derivative of the universe with respect to his sacrifice is 0. The partial derivative of U with respect to S sub B equals 0. And that is precisely what makes his sacrifice so profound. It was a purely human act of integrity, done for truth's own sake. What was this universe he defended so stubbornly? Let us recall it once more. It was not the tidy, walled garden of the medieval mind, with its neat celestial spheres and its divinely appointed center. It was a wild, untamed, and exhilarating wilderness. It was a universe of dizzying scale and infinite potential. It was a universe where our sun was just one star among a countless glittering host, where the Earth was just one planet among a throng of other worlds orbiting other suns. It was a universe teeming with the possibility of other lives, other thoughts, other histories unfolding in the silent darkness between the stars. It was, in short, a universe very much like the one we now know to be real. His crime was not heresy. His crime was that he was 400 years ahead of his time. He saw the cosmos not with a telescope, but with the raw power of his philosophical imagination. He did not discover new worlds, he unshackled them. He took the Copernican model, which was still a fenced-in solar system, and he blew the fences away. His vision was an affront to the cosmic vanity of his age. The idea that humanity was not the star of the show, that the earth was not the center stage, that God might be engaged in countless other creative projects across an infinite canvas, this was an intolerable blow to the ego. They burned him not for his bad science, but for his magnificent, humbling, and terrifying theology. And so they lit the fire, a very human response to a cosmic idea. They tried to fight a concept of infinity with a few cartloads of wood. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. It was a category error of epic proportions. The fire they lit in the Campo de' Fiori that day was a monument to their own failure of imagination. In the end, what did his sacrifice accomplish? In the short term, it accomplished exactly what the Inquisition wanted. It terrified people. It silenced dissent. The number of Italian philosophers speculating about the plurality of worlds dropped rather sharply for a generation or two. The lesson was learned. But in the long term, the fire backfired spectacularly. The story of his death became a dark legend, a myth that fueled the very spirit of rebellion the Church sought to crush. He became a symbol for the scientific revolution that was dawning. His ghost haunted the conscience of Europe, a reminder of the brutal cost of intellectual suppression. He showed future thinkers the absolute worst-case scenario, and in doing so, perhaps gave them the courage to risk a little less. Was it worth it? To die in such agony for an idea? From a purely practical standpoint, it seems like a terrible bargain. But Bruno wasn't a practical man. He was a man of principle. And the principle he died for was that the universe is as it is, regardless of what any human authority declares it to be. Truth is not subject to a vote, or a papal decree, or a committee of cardinals. He died to defend the dignity of reality itself. He defended the right of the cosmos to be as grand and as mysterious as it truly is, and the right of the human mind to at least attempt to grapple with that grandeur. His was a final, bloody-minded stand against the arrogance of those who would tame the infinite and put God in a box. And so they lit the fire, a very human response to a cosmic idea. They tried to fight a concept of infinity with a few cartloads of wood. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. It was a category error of epic proportions. The fire they lit in the Campo de' Fiori that day was a monument to their own failure of imagination. In the end, what did his sacrifice accomplish? In the short term, it accomplished exactly what the Inquisition wanted. It terrified people. It silenced dissent. The number of Italian philosophers speculating about the plurality of worlds dropped rather sharply for a generation or two. The lesson was learned. But in the long term, the fire backfired spectacularly. The story of his death became a dark legend, a myth that fueled the very spirit of rebellion the Church sought to crush. He became a symbol for the scientific revolution that was dawning. His ghost haunted the conscience of Europe, a reminder of the brutal cost of intellectual suppression. He showed future thinkers the absolute worst-case scenario, and in doing so, perhaps gave them the courage to risk.
The fire is out. The crowd is gone. The square is empty. The authorities in Rome on that February day in the year 1600 must have breathed a collective sigh of relief. The problem of Giordano Bruno had been solved. The troublemaker was silenced. The heretic was purged. The man was gone. They had won. It is one of history's great ironies that they could not have been more wrong. Their final act of erasure was to gather his ashes from the smoldering pyre and cast them into the Tiber River. The symbolism was clear. Let him be scattered, dissolved, returned to nothingness. Let no grave mark his passing, no relic remain for his misguided followers to venerate. Let him vanish from the physical world as they intended his ideas to vanish from the world of thought. It was a thorough and tidy disposal, and like every other attempt to control the legacy of the Nolan, it was a spectacular failure. They could scatter his atoms, but they could not scatter his words. While his ashes flowed to the sea, his books, the vessels of his spirit, were already lodged in the great libraries and secret collections of Europe. They had a life of their own, a resilience that flesh and bone could never match. The Church, of course, did its best. Bruno's entire body of work was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of forbidden books. To own or read his work was to risk the same fate he had suffered. This was meant to be a final, definitive silencing, a quarantine placed around his dangerous philosophy. For centuries, this ban was largely effective at keeping him out of the mainstream. But putting a book on a forbidden list is a funny thing. For the obedient, it is a warning. For the curious, it is a recommendation. The Index, for the free thinkers of the Enlightenment and beyond, became the most exciting reading list in the world. By telling people what not to read, the Church inadvertently curated a library of rebellion. Bruno was a charter member of this exclusive club. They thought they burned me to silence a man. They burned me to create a martyr, a symbol. My ashes, they say, were thrown into the Tiber River, but my ideas flew on the wind. Rather ironic victory, that one. They could not control the wind, and they could not control the intellectual currents that would carry his thoughts across the continent. His influence on the generations that followed is not a straight, clean line. He was not a scientist in the modern sense. He left no new data, no equations, no testable models. His legacy was something more fundamental and perhaps more powerful. He was a philosophical bomb maker. He didn't build the new house of science, but he did a great deal of the demolition on the old prison of dogma. Thinkers like Galileo, who faced the Inquisition just a few decades later, knew Bruno's story intimately. It served as a terrifying warning, which certainly informed Galileo's pragmatic decision to recant. But it also proved that the Church's doctrines were not unassailable. Bruno had shown that a man could stand against the entire system, even if it cost him his life. He normalized a level of intellectual audacity that had previously been unthinkable. Later philosophers like Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz grappled with his pantheistic ideas of a God immanent in an infinite nature. His work was a part of the bubbling intellectual cauldron from which the modern world would emerge. He was not the father of modern cosmology, but he was perhaps its wild, prophetic godfather, the one who spoke the impossible truths that others would later prove with mathematics and observation. For 2 centuries, however, his name was mostly a whisper, a byword for atheism and heresy. He was a dark legend, a cautionary tale. The Church's campaign of suppression had, on the surface, worked. He was too radical, too strange, too magical for the rationalists of the Enlightenment. He remained a fringe figure, a ghost haunting the margins of intellectual history. But ghosts have a way of returning. In the 19th century, as the political map of Europe was redrawn, Bruno was rediscovered. In Italy, struggling for its unification and independence from the temporal power of the papacy, he was reborn as a national hero. He was no longer just a heretic. He was a proto-patriot, a man who had seen the future and was murdered by the past. His legacy was weaponized in the ongoing culture war between secularism and the Church. The ultimate act of this posthumous victory came in 1889. An international committee, with supporters from across Europe and America, raised funds to erect a monument to him. And they chose to place it in the one spot on earth that would be the most profound and public rebuke to his executors, the center of the Campo de' Fiori, on the very ground where his pyre had stood. The Vatican was apoplectic. Pope Leo XIII denounced the statue as a work of satanic insolence and spent the day of its unveiling in fasting and prayer, mourning the triumph of Masonic anti-clericalism. The statue, he fumed, was a celebration of a man whose work was a mess of abject filth and evil. The wound, it seemed, was still fresh after nearly 300 years. And there the statue stands today, a dark, defiant figure in a monk's cowl, staring broodingly towards St. Peter's Basilica. He is home. The wanderer has returned not as a prisoner, but as a permanent bronze resident in the heart of the city that rejected him. It is perhaps the most successful posthumous comeback in history. The legacy of fire, it turns out, was not of erasure, but of forging. The flames hardened his story into a legend that could not be broken. The authorities' attempt to control his narrative failed so completely that their very act of cruelty became the source of his enduring fame. The harder they tried to erase him, the more permanent his legacy became. We can state this as a final ironic law. LB is proportional to AE. Bruno's legacy is directly proportional to the authorities' effort to erase it. He taught us that a universe of infinite worlds is a thrilling possibility. He taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. And his executioners taught us that an institution that must resort to burning a man alive has already lost the argument. He remains a complex figure. He was not a saint. He was arrogant, abrasive, and difficult. His philosophy was a wild mix of brilliant intuition, mysticism, and Renaissance magic. He was, in other words, profoundly human. And it is this flawed human courage that makes his story so powerful. He was not a perfect vessel, but he carried a perfect message. Think for yourself. And what is the final, unsilenced truth? It is that reality is always larger than our models of it. It is that dogmas are cages, and the human spirit is meant to be free. It is that the quest for knowledge will always have its martyrs, but the quest itself is unstoppable. It is that a single man's life is finite, but an idea, once it has been set free, can be truly infinite. This has been the monumental intellectual struggle of Giordano Bruno, a man who saw infinity and refused to look away. His life was a testament to the power of a single, unyielding voice. His death was a testament to the fear that voice inspired. And his legacy is a testament to the ultimate triumph of the idea over the flame. If you are still here, still processing, still thinking about the man and his universe, then his legacy is alive in you. The wind that carried his ideas has reached you across 4 centuries. To honor that journey and to ensure that stories of intellectual courage continue to be told, there is one final, simple act. Subscribe. Join this community of curious minds, and, in your own way, keep the fire of inquiry burning. The roar intensifies. The fire, in its mindless hunger, reaches its peak. This is the crescendo of my small human story, a symphony of combustion, a final, violent purification. But there is no pain here now. The nerves are ash, the body a ruined instrument. The signal, however, the signal has never been clearer. The noise of this world is fading, and the silence of the cosmos is beginning to sing. The static of mortality gives way to the clear broadcast of the infinite. And so, as the fire consumes and my spirit ascends to the infinite universe I loved, this has been Giordano Bruno, your humble and eternally convicted broadcaster from the heart of dogma. For years I have been transmitting from hostile territory, a pirate radio signal of reason from behind enemy lines. My equipment was crude, just a restless mind and a stubborn tongue. My audience was often small, sometimes non-existent, but I believe the message broke through the noise. We have journeyed together through the cramped, comfortable lies of the old cosmos and into the terrifying freedom of the new. We saw the fear in the eyes of powerful men, men who would rather burn a world than expand their minds. We felt the injustice of a trial where the verdict was written centuries before the accused was born. And we bore witness here, in this final broadcast, to the simple, undeniable truth that truth is a fire that cannot be contained. You can burn the book, but you cannot burn the words. Now the fire recedes. The roar becomes a crackle. The heat becomes a memory. The wind whistles through the ruins of my earthly form, a lonely sound in a suddenly quiet square. My voice, too, is a whisper on this wind, a fading signal. The transmission is almost over. The power is failing. But before the final silence, a last word for you, the listener who has tuned in across the oceans of time. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the very heart of a philosophical martyrdom has given you a moment of profound contemplation, if it has made you look up at your own night sky with a little more wonder, or perhaps made you appreciate your own era's precious and hard-won freedom of thought, then my purpose is served. My only goal was to pry open a window in a locked room to let in a single ray of starlight. So do not let that window close. Keep listening, not just to me, but to the dissenters, the questioners, the artists, the madmen, the scientists in your own time. Keep questioning every dogma, every certainty, especially your own. And for the sake of all that is true and beautiful in the heavens, for the love of the infinite possibilities I died for, keep that subscribe button pressed. See it not as a click, but as a vote. A vote for curiosity over certainty, a vote for the open sky over the closed box. Because even when a man is silenced, the universe and the ideas he plants will never stop expanding. The cosmos breathes on, indifferent and magnificent. It expands into the void, creating new space, new time, new worlds. So too does a single powerful idea. It finds a home in a willing mind, replicates and spreads. They thought my death was an endpoint, a final solution. It was a genesis, a big bang of defiance. My destination is now that beautiful, endless expansion. The journey continues towards infinity. The static is rising. The carrier wave weakens. It is time to sign off from this station. I leave you with the stars, my silent, eternal witnesses. Do not mourn the ashes. Look for me in the endless patterns of the cosmos, in the courage of a new discovery, in the simple, profound joy of a question well asked. Until the next broadcast, from a different, perhaps more enlightened realm. Farewell, my friends.